Welcome back to our class, Genesis, the Conflict Over Creation. We're glad that you joined us to study how to handle and carefully interpret the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. Our instructor is James Rochford. In this episode, we will study whether the book of Genesis borrowed its creation account from the surrounding ancient Near Eastern mythologies.
Several ancient Near Eastern mythologies predate the Hebrew scriptures by several centuries, containing similarities with the book of Genesis. Consequently, critics of the Bible argue that Genesis copied from these creation and flood mythologies, being just one among many ancient myths.
Okay, Enuma Elish is one of the oldest creation myths ever uncovered. I think it is the oldest. And it tells of creation not in 7 days, but is written on 7 tablets, and details 7 generations of gods. The key one being that the 6th generation created man to complete creation so that the 7th generation of gods could rest. See a parallel there? That theme was repeated in the Epic of Atrahasis, wherein the Elohim essentially said, "Let us make man in our image," and they did, using a golem spell, which is a traditional Semitic
Herman
spell.
Gunkel, for example, held that Genesis 1 through 11 was legendary, and that Genesis borrowed its creation narratives from the Babylonians. Recently, Peter Enns wrote that the opening chapters of Genesis participate in a worldview that the earliest Israelites shared with their Mesopotamian neighbors. The stories of Genesis had a context, he says, and that context was not a modern scientific one, but an ancient mythic one. Well, did Genesis steal the creation account from the Enuma Elish? The Enuma Elish predates the book of Genesis by a few hundred years. It's dated to roughly 1700 BC. And both the Babylonians and the Assyrians held that the Enuma Elish was their creation account. Archaeologists discovered this ancient Mesopotamian creation account in Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, who was an Assyrian king. Pieces and parts of the Enuma Elish were also found in Ashur, which is modern-day Assyria, and Uruk. They consist of 7 Akkadian cuneiform tablets. George Smith was famous for publishing the text of the Enuma Elish in his book, which he titled The Chaldean Genesis, in 1876. Now, to summarize this account, for those who are not familiar, the Enuma Elish begins with a watery chaos. The water divides into the freshwater god Apsu and the saltwater goddess Tiamat. These 2 deities copulate, have sex, and give birth to lesser deities. These gods loudly keep the god Apsu awake at night, and they harass him in his work during the day. And so finally, Apsu decides to wipe them out. But, in a moment of concern, their mother, the goddess Tiamat, warns her oldest son, Ea, who is also called Enki or Enlil. And Ea kills Apsu before Apsu can kill him. Well, the death of Apsu sends Tiamat into a bloodthirsty rage, and she creates monsters to kill her children. One of these gods, the champion Marduk, kills Tiamat and her champion Kingu. Marduk splits Tiamat in half with an arrow, creating the waters below on the earth and the waters above in the sky. Afterward, Ea uses Kingu's blood to create the first man, Lulu. Well, what's our assessment of the comparison between Genesis and the Enuma Elish? Critics are simply downplaying the differences. Now, similarities surely exist between Genesis and the Enuma Elish, but unfortunately, critics have exaggerated these superficial similarities while simultaneously downplaying the differences. I mean, even a cursory reading of both texts reveals the stark dissimilarities between these 2 accounts. For one, Genesis teaches monotheism, while the Enuma Elish teaches polytheism. The Mesopotamian myths describe a pantheon of deities who act like corrupt and merciless humans. By contrast, Genesis depicts only one creator of the universe whose creation is very good, according to Genesis 1:31. Second, Genesis depicts God as self-existent, while the Enuma Elish states that the gods themselves were contingent. You see, after the Mesopotamian gods emerge, the universe springs from the war or the sex, or in some cases the warlike sex, of the Mesopotamian gods and goddesses. The beginning stages of creation are ascribed to sexual congress. To put this simply, the Genesis account explains cosmogony, which is the birth of the universe, whereas the Babylonian account deals with theogony, the birth of the gods. So one explains the birth of the universe, while the other explains the birth of the gods. Third, Genesis pictures humans as the crown of creation, while the Enuma Elish considers humans as mere slave labor. Genesis 1 climbs to a literary crescendo with the capstone of creation, human beings. These humans bear the very image and the likeness of God, according to Genesis 1:27, and God gives them sovereign leadership over the earth as a gift. Meanwhile, the Mesopotamian myths depict humans as divine slaves. According to the Enuma Elish, man's purpose in life was to be the service of the gods. Instead of being made in the image of the gods, Ea creates the first humans from the bloody corpse of the gods. Fourth, Genesis describes a creation from nothing, but the Enuma Elish considers matter as eternal. Assyriologist Alexander Heidel writes this. He says, Apsu and Tiamat represented the living, uncreated world matter. They were matter and divine spirit united and coexistent, like body and soul. Later he writes this, it is apparent that for the Babylonians, matter was eternal. The Hebrew scriptures teach that God simply spoke the material universe into existence. You know, the psalmist writes this, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. He spoke, and it was done. Psalm 33, verse 6. Whereas the Babylonian deities had no such power. As Heidel writes, the word of the Babylonian deities was not almighty. Fifth, Genesis describes the sun, the moon, and the stars as mere creations, whereas the Enuma Elish considered these to be gods. Heidel notes that the luminary bodies and their purposes in astronomical terms were interwoven with mythology. This is diametrically opposed to the Hebrew worldview, which forbid the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars, according to Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter. Sixth, Genesis gives no description of a cosmic conflict, whereas the Enuma Elish begins with the gruesome conflict of the gods. In fact, the first 4 tablets of the Enuma Elish deal almost exclusively with the contest between Marduk and Tiamat and events leading up to this, while the creation story proper occupies less than 2 tablets. Meanwhile, Genesis 1 and 2 contain no conflict whatsoever, only God's peaceful and purposeful creation. Even critical scholar Gerhard von Rad comments that, quote, not even a trace of one hostile to God can be detected. Now, we do admit that we read about Satan, the serpent, in Genesis 3, and yet the text depicts Satan as made by God, Genesis 3:1, and he just sits there and passively accepts God's judgment without saying a word in Genesis 3:14 and 15. Seventh, Genesis describes the fall of humans, not the gods. Heidel writes this. He says, if it is at all permissible to speak of a fall, it was a fall of the gods, not of man. It was the gods who disturbed the peace. Of course, this is in stark contrast with the biblical account, which teaches that God's creation was very good. Genesis 1:31. Eighth, Genesis offers an elegant simplicity to the creation account, while the Enuma Elish is far more complex, cruel, and convoluted. You see, myths typically become more elaborate over time, even as they become less grounded in history. Ancient Near Eastern historian K.A. Kitchen writes this. He says, the common view that the Hebrew account is simply a purged and simplified version of the Babylonian legend, applied also to the flood stories, is fallacious on methodological grounds. In the ancient Near East, the rule is that the simple accounts or traditions may give rise, by accretion and embellishment, to elaborate legends, but not vice versa. Here we see that Kitchen argues the distinct possibility that the Enuma Elish actually borrowed from the simple and elegant Hebrew account, not vice versa. So let's recap. Genesis is monotheistic, whereas the Enuma Elish is polytheistic. Genesis represents that God is self-existent and the universe is contingent, whereas in the Enuma Elish, the universe is self-existent and the gods are contingent. In Genesis, humans rule over creation, whereas in the Enuma Elish, humans are basically slave labor. In Genesis, God is eternal. In the Enuma Elish, matter and energy are eternal. In Genesis, the sun, the moon, and the stars are just mere creations. They're just the furniture of the universe. Whereas in the Enuma Elish, the sun, the moon, and the stars were worshipped and really deified. In Genesis, God creates the universe and everything in it without conflict. Whereas in the Enuma Elish, the gods create out of the conflict that they have with one another. In Genesis, humans become fallen. Whereas in the Enuma Elish, the gods themselves are fallen. And finally, Genesis is a simple, straightforward account, whereas the Enuma Elish has massive mythological and legendary embellishments. Some critics have raised the question of whether or not the deep mentioned in Genesis 1:2 refers to the goddess Tiamat. Critics contend that the Hebrew word for deep, which is the word tehom, is similar to the Akkadian term Tiamat, who, as you remember, was the watery goddess in the Enuma Elish.
Deep. Remember the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk, the storm god, who released his wind against Tiamat, the primeval deep, the primeval water, representing the forces of chaos. And you should immediately hear the great similarities. Our story opens with a temporal clause, when on high, when God began creating. We have a wind that sweeps over chaotic waters, just like the wind of Marduk released into the face of Tiamat. And the Hebrew term is particularly fascinating. In fact, the text says, and there is darkness on the face of deep. No definite article. The word deep is a proper name, perhaps. The Hebrew word is tehom, means deep. And etymologically, it's exactly the same word as Tiamat. The at ending is just feminine. So tehom, it's the same word. It's a related word.
Since Genesis uses a similar word to refer to the watery darkness of the primitive planet Earth, these critics, they claim that this is an example of the Bible plagiarizing the Enuma Elish. Really, this is like one of the zombies from The Walking Dead. This is an old argument that simply refuses to die. It keeps coming up over and over. It's just simply not true. It's become a staple in critical scholarship, but without any adequate basis. Let me explain. K.A. Kitchen calls any such literary connection a, quote, complete fallacy. Why would he say this? Here's a few reasons why. For one, he notes that the Hebrew noun is unaugmented. That means that it's just a common noun, whereas the Akkadian word is a derived form, which makes it a proper name. Second, the context of the Akkadian word implies a goddess, whereas the context for the Hebrew word implies just a common noun, the water, the deep. Third, the Ugaritic language also used the word tehom to refer to the deep, even as early as the 2nd millennium BC, earlier than the Enuma Elish. And there is no conceivable link with the Babylonian epic. Fourth, the text later states that God brought the water from the deep, the tehom in Hebrew, to flood the earth in Genesis chapter 7. But clearly, this doesn't refer to a water goddess. It just refers to a natural source of water. Finally, we might add that the greater context of Genesis 1 shows no struggle at all between rival deities or gods, unlike the other ancient Near Eastern accounts. This is why Alexander Heidel, an expert in Assyriology, sees no connection at all between the description in Genesis of the deep and the goddess Tiamat. Some critics have raised the question as to whether the Jewish people adopted these Babylonian myths even as late as the exile in the 6th century BC. They argue that the author, or in their view, the authors of Genesis, borrowed the contents of Genesis 1 through 11 from Babylonian mythology when the Jewish people were exiled in Babylon. Critical scholar Joseph Blenkinsop argues that the story of creation was written after 586 BC to explain the exile. So just as Israel lived in a wonderful land but was expelled for disobedience, so too Adam and Eve were also expelled from Eden for the same reason. Moreover, just as Israel was seduced by Canaanite idolatry, so too Adam and Eve were seduced by the serpent to disobey. Well, this view is as untenable as it is unreasonable. For one, there are very good independent lines of evidence to believe in what is called Mosaic authorship, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch in roughly 1400 BC. So this would mean that these critics are dating the book of Genesis nearly 1,000 years after it purports to have been written. But beyond this, let's just ignore that for a second and shelve that argument. Are we really to believe that the Hebrew exiles adopted Babylonian beliefs immediately after the exile? You know, one of the psalmists in the Hebrew Bible says this, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" Psalm 137. James Hoffmeyer writes this, "It is hard to believe that Jewish priests and prophets in Babylon who longed for Zion and felt the shame of being in a foreign land would quickly embrace pagan, foreign myths encountered in Babylon and integrate them into the Torah. Moreover, are we supposed to believe that Daniel and his 3 friends would reject the Babylonian food, all the while to guzzle down the mythological belief system in Babylon? Would Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego risk facing the fires of incineration in Daniel 3 simply because they wouldn't bow to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, but then wholesale adopt Babylonian beliefs? In order to avoid this, these critical scholars have to late date the book of Daniel as well, to 167 BC, rather than in the 6th century BC. We should also point out that after the exile, after the Jewish people come back into their land, the prophets, what are called the post-exilic prophets, the prophets that come after the exile, we note in their writings that there is a noticeable absence of any kind of critique against idolatry. After the exile is over, one of the things we notice the most in Jewish history is that idolatry was purged from Israel. And yet, we're to believe that this is the exact same time that these Jewish people adopted the Babylonian creation myth. Well, this just stretches our credulity to its breaking point, absolutely. Well, how do we explain the similarities between the accounts of Genesis and also these other ancient Near Eastern accounts, such as the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish? Well, Christian scholars have traditionally given two explanations for these similarities. The first is that Genesis is a polemic against polytheism. A polemic is basically an argument or an attack. And so under this view, Moses knew about these other accounts. However, he crafted an elegant account in Genesis to refute these polytheistic religions and myths. And this is certainly plausible. Moses, of course, was well read in polytheistic writing. He grew up in the Pharaoh's court in Exodus 1 and 2. Stephen refers to him as a well-read in all of the literature of the Egyptians in Acts chapter 7, verse 22. And so he would have been familiar with these other ancient Near Eastern myths. And the book of Genesis could be his outright repudiation of them. Under this view, Genesis is providing for the Israelites an alternative to the myths within their environment. It is natural that it should address at least some of the same subjects. In fact, we should be surprised that we do not find more similarities between Genesis 1 and these ancient Near Eastern mythologies. The second explanation is that Genesis gives an accurate account of the events, whereas the other ancient Near Eastern accounts give a garbled transmission of what happened. You see, if a massive, life-ending flood really occurred, as the Bible teaches, this would be seared into the memory of those who survived. And it is argued that perhaps the Mesopotamian accounts muddled this memory through some kind of oral tradition. Meanwhile, Genesis gives a simple, straightforward, historical account of the events in question. And this has a certain level of plausibility. Abraham, of course, came from Ur. He came from Mesopotamia in roughly 2000 BC, according to Genesis 10 and 11. And so it shouldn't surprise us that he would carry on these stories, or at least be cognizant of these stories from the surrounding religions and cultures. To conclude, as we've seen here, Genesis does contain similarities between the surrounding mythologies of the day regarding the creation. However, these could be due to Moses attacking these ancient accounts, or it could be evidence of a shared memory and history, or perhaps a mixture of both. We're not sure. But the idea that the Hebrews would wholesale adopt Babylonian beliefs is simply untenable. And really, a critical examination of these texts shows a forceful clash of worldviews, not a fusion of them. In fact, I'd like to say that the best argument that we could raise against thinking that Genesis borrowed from the Enuma Elish is simply to read the Enuma Elish. Read this account for yourself, and you will see the incredible worldview clash between the Babylonian perspective and the Hebrew perspective.